Hi guys, so today we're going to talk about the why of land conservation, and I wanted to start off with the multiple benefits theory just as a way to lay the groundwork for this conversation. This is a theory that highlights the idea that conserving land offers usually layered benefits, a wide array of often interconnected benefits that rather than land serving a single purpose. This theory emphasizes the fact that land conservation is not just about protecting natural areas, but also about generating some diverse and long-term advantages for society, for the environment, and even for the economy. So the first benefit that we might talk about is environmental protections. We know that conserved land preserves ecosystems, it protects biodiversity, it maintains natural processes like water filtration, carbon sequestration, soil regulation. These environmental benefits are crucial to sustaining life, including human life, and also for mitigating for climate change. But at its very base, land protection is an essential component of sustaining biodiversity. Economic value and land conservation to sustain working lands, including working forest and agricultural lands, is a topic that is often discussed. Generally speaking, land conservation can have significant economic benefits. It can support sustainable agriculture, forestry, or ecotourism. And healthy ecosystems also provide essential services like clean water, fertile soil, pollination, and we know that all of these things are essential for human communities as well as natural communities. A hand-in-glove outcome often of conservation is historical and cultural preservation. Conserved lands are often also protect sites that are culturally or historically significant. They might have archaeological significance, and this allows us to preserve the heritage and the identity of communities. It gives us opportunity for education as well as recreational opportunities that connect people with their history and their natural surroundings. And of course, public health and recreation, access to recreation are an important component of land conservation. So access to conserved lands enhances public health by providing a space for recreation and physical activity as well as mental well-being. And we know that these areas often offer opportunities for outdoor activities and stress release, connection with nature, and all of these things contribute to overall quality of life. And the final topic I wanted to cover is resilience and sustainability. This aspect of land conservation is one that really has grown in the couple of decades that I've worked in the realm of land conservation. So we know that by conserving land, communities build resilience against environmental challenges such as climate change and natural disasters, as well as resource scarcity. So protected areas can act as buffers. They can help to mitigate from some of the worst impacts of climate change, including floods and wildfires and other extreme weather events. All to say that the multiple benefits theory underscores the fact that land conservation is a holistic approach that generates a range of benefits and generally speaking creates a positive feedback loop that helps support environmental sustainability, economic prosperity, and social well-being. I wanted to make the connection of the multiple benefits theory to the textbook and to conservation easements specifically. Chapter 3 in your textbook presents articles that part of the reading for this week that document the various ways in which conservation easements are being used to protect resources. And the chapter is not exhaustive, but it does aim to provide a sample of sort of the breadth of conservation easement utility, including the categories listed in this figure out of y'all's textbook. One of the challenges that the authors of the textbook found in providing an overview of the breadth of the use of conservation easements as a tool is that they tend to be clustered around issues rather than around some of the categorical uses of the tool. So, for example, there's been a lack of literature on historic and cultural resource protection through conservation easements, or the use of conservation easements in social impact or green investing. So this will be an important part of this week's reading and the lecture today. Just to underscore the importance of land conservation in protecting biodiversity and natural communities, I wanted to hit a few more points on this topic. We know that land conservation plays a crucial role in preserving ecosystems, in protecting endangered species, and in maintaining biodiversity or species richness in general. Conserving land helps to protect systems from degradation caused by human activities, such as deforestation, urbanization, and pollution. We know that protecting natural habitats through conservation is essential for the survival of endangered species, and is certainly a component of the Endangered Species Act. Many species are threatened by habitat loss or alteration, which we know is the leading cause of extinction. Conservation areas, particularly natural habitats, can provide safe havens where species can thrive and reproduce. They can maintain healthy populations. When we preserve critical habitats for endangered species, that ensures they have the space and the resources that they need to survive. It also supports biodiversity at many levels. We might think of biodiversity as mostly the diversity of the species, but another component of that is actually genetic diversity. And more expansive and connected conserved lands essentially is critical for protecting a connected gene pool that allows species to adapt and thrive over time. So overall, we know that land conservation is a fundamental process to sustaining natural processes, supporting life on Earth, and ensuring health and richness of our ecosystems. I wanted to differentiate a little bit between sustaining biodiversity on public lands versus conservation easement lands. And it is probably worth saying that we do regard the highest level of protection often to be lands that are owned and managed by our public resource agencies, especially if those agencies have a mission linked to preserving and protecting wildlife populations. So public lands in the U.S. play a central role in protecting biodiversity. They can protect vast and diverse areas that serve as habitat for a range of species. We know that these types of lands are managed by federal, state, and sometimes local agencies, and the lands can include national parks, national forests, national wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas. Collectively, these public lands cover millions of acres of habitat across many different ecosystems. We can look at the benefits that come from this public land ownership across categories as well. We know that there is, of course, public lands protect essential habitats for thousands of species, including rare and threatened and endangered species. And by having connected public lands, we're able to maintain large contiguous areas of natural habitat. These lands can ensure that species have the space they need to thrive and reproduce and maintain healthy populations. We know that these areas are also provisioning. They are providing ecosystem services that support biodiversity through clean water, nutrient cycling, and pollination. Public lands can encompass entire watersheds, forests, wetlands, and grasslands that are integral to the health of the ecosystem. They also can allow for the disturbance mechanisms that are essential for those ecosystems to thrive. And of course, connectivity and corridors are an important part of what public lands can provide. They can provide crucial wildlife corridors, connecting otherwise fragmented habitat, allowing species to migrate or disperse, allowing for gene flow, and also allowing species to adapt to changing conditions over time. So that connectivity we know is essential for maintaining genetic diversity and resilience, especially in the face of climate change. And the fourth point is public lands allow for sustained conservation, research, and management. And we know that this is ideal in really being able to sustain ecosystems, rare ecosystems, or ones that require extensive management to remove invasives or provide prescribed burning and other sort of management practices that can be hard for a private landowner. So public lands are often sites for scientific research and conservation management practices that are really aimed at preserving biodiversity. All that to say that biodiversity can also be an important component of the purpose of a conservation easement. So although land trusts are involved in a wide variety of land conservation activities, and the easements can be donated under Section 170 for 4 very different conservation purposes, including habitat protection. A lot of land trusts do list protection of habitat as either their sole focus of a conservation easement or as one of their primary focuses. So examples of the use of conservation easements to protect biodiversity are common. In addition, even land trusts that focus on other conservation purposes can achieve incidental protection of biodiversity, of course. So protection of working lands as an economic benefit of conservation easements is, we know, vital for sustaining agricultural productivity, local agriculture, supporting rural economies, and preserving cultural landscapes. Working lands can include farms, ranches, and forests, and we know that they're essential for food production, resource management, and for livelihoods. And we also know that these lands in some regions face increasing pressure from urbanization, industrial development, or conversion of all different sorts. Land conservation is a really powerful tool to safeguard working lands from some of these threats and promote sustainable uses. The voluntary agreement that is a conservation easement between landowners and a conservation organization can restrict certain types of development while allowing for traditional uses to continue. So they can help to prevent the conversion to non-agricultural uses. And easements can ensure that farmland and forests remain productive and contribute to local economies. That kind of protection not only supports food security, but also helps to maintain ecological functions that working lands can provide, including things like water filtration, carbon sequestration, and wildlife habitat. Also, conserving working lands helps to preserve cultural heritage, and we'll talk about that a little more, the rural character of communities. It can keep family farms and ranches intact, allowing generational knowledge and practices to be passed down. And by balancing conservation with sustainable use, working lands can thrive economically while contributing to broader environmental goals. It's worth noting that conservation easement policy allows farmers and ranchers even more favorable tax benefits. And when we get into the nitty-gritty of conservation easements, we'll talk a little more about some of that. It's interesting to look into some of the other incentives that are provided to working lands to help actually protect wildlife and biodiversity as well. The Farm Bill is a really important tool, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, is an agency group that provides really important technical and financial assistance to working farms and forests that participate to improve their working lands to benefit wildlife. And this is a partnership that takes place with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It can provide participants with regulatory predictability for the Endangered Species Act when needed. The approach allows landowners with a means to make on-the-ground improvements and provide peace of mind that no matter what the legal status of a species, they can keep their working lands working. Part of your reading for this week reflects on working lands and conservation. Part of that reading acknowledges that over the last several decades, conservation easements have begun to rival some of the more traditional land conservation methods like park designation or fee simple government acquisition. And an easement can be an attractive tool for conservation in the South, especially given the fact that 87% of southern forests are in private ownership. In the South, in particular, the utilization of conservation easements on private land has lagged behind the rest of the country. And so your reading reflects on what can be done to address that lag. As we already mentioned, cultural and historical preservation are often a co-benefit or a primary benefit of land conservation. It plays a crucial role in preserving cultural and historic heritage in the U.S. Across the country, numerous sites of historical, archaeological, or cultural significance are safeguarded because of conservation efforts, fee simple ownership in many cases. Protected areas can include battlefields, indigenous sacred sites, historic farms, or landmarks that help to tell the story of the past. And by conserving these lands, we of course ensure that future generations can connect with and learn from our history in a context that allows them to experience the story. And conservation of historic sites, of course, helps to preserve the physical remnants of significant events or cultural practices. It allows for a more authentic context in people's experience. For example, preserving Civil War battlefields or Native American ancestral lands can be invaluable for educational and interpretive opportunities. Conservation efforts also protect landscapes that have cultural significance to communities. So these more expansive areas may carry on with things like traditional farming, protection of the setting of a historic town, or cultural landscapes that have been shaped by human activity over centuries. There's some organizations that protect these type of sites. The National Trust for Historic Preservation and many other local land trusts have this kind of historical conservation written into their mission. You don't have to look far to come across news about the clash that's been happening between economic development and protection of historic communities across South Carolina. This is a debate that has been unfolding in recent months and years, including the small rural community that I grew up in, Back Swamp, South Carolina, just outside of Florence, that is just a stone's throw from a new Buc-ee's on I-95. Another reading that is in your textbook focuses in on cultural resource protection and the role that conservation easements play. We know that since 1964, the federal tax code has allowed for deductions for historic preservation conservation easements. So for many years, landowners have donated or sold their rights to alter their historic buildings. These historic preservation easements purport to protect historical buildings and structures in perpetuity are a type of conservation easement. But after a string of articles in the Washington Post in 2004 and a series of congressional hearings questioned the wisdom and legitimacy of this tool, conservation easements of all types came under greater scrutiny. So while most of the writing about conservation easements has focused on those seeking to protect ecological and natural features of land, a lot of our case law centers on conservation easements that actually protect historic buildings. The article in your book is focused in on describing historic preservation easements and gives an overview of developing the law in that particular area. And we've sort of already made this point, but it is interesting to think about the different scales that we can view the protection of historic and cultural resources. It can be at the scale of a building or a site, or it could be at the scale of a much larger community. And so this is a map from a land trust organization that I get to work with quite a bit, based out of Florence, South Carolina. And the map shows target areas, existing protected areas, actually the Clemson experimental station, the agricultural station, and the PD, and sites that the land trust might target to sort of preserve the integrity of that historic farming community. Another important aspect of land conservation efforts is, of course, recreation and access to natural areas that are open to the public. Often, it is the fee simple acquisitions that result in public use rights. However, it's interesting that some conservation easements on private land can also include public access as a component of that easement. By conserving lands, we know that communities can have access to these natural areas, that they can remain undeveloped and available for recreational activities, especially for passive recreational activities, which can be component of either an easement or fee simple ownership. Conserved lands are not necessarily meant for ball fields and tennis courts, but for passive recreation opportunities like hiking, camping, fishing, bird watching, and more. Of course, access to outdoor spaces provides and promotes physical and mental well-being while also fostering a deeper connection with nature. And we, of course, have the assumption that folks that have the opportunity to have access to the natural world show up with an altered view when they show up at the ballot box for protecting natural resources. We know that conserved lands often move into the realm of some sort of park or reserve ownership, public parks and trails, nature reserves, national and state parks, wildlife refuges, conserved forests are all examples of these. It's worth mentioning that access to nature is something that's not distributed equally across the landscape, and that's equitable access to the outdoors, and feeling safe and welcome in places that are public has certainly been a topic of conversation in recent years. There are some cool tools that you'd find online if you search under this topic. The Trust for Public Land has created a site called Conserve. It's the country's most comprehensive database for parks. It allows you to search and look at over 15,000 different cities and towns across the country and assess the accessibility of these places to parks. So across those urban areas that account for more than 100 million people and 28 million kids, many of them do not have a park space within a 10-minute walking distance of their home. So some of the campaigns that we've seen recently include this topic, just access to parks and open space, and for those to be within walking distance of high population centers' homes. And of course, we know that natural protected areas offer a multitude of ecosystem services that are essential for maintaining environmental health and biodiversity, as well as human well-being. Ecosystem services are natural processes and functions that the ecosystem provides, and they benefit natural and human communities, of course. We can look at these broken into types: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. Through land conservation, these ecosystem services are protected and enhanced, and this, of course, is essential. Some examples of these include water purification and regulation. One of the most the easiest ways to provide fresh water is by sustaining forest cover within a watershed. And so that, of course, water purification and regulation. This includes buffering during drought times and buffering during flood events. And natural resources and natural landscapes do that best. So forests and wetlands and grasslands, of course, act as filters that remove pollutants from water and are essential to that provisioning service. Another provisioning service, of course, is carbon regulation. And we have a pretty deep understanding now of the role that land conservation and forest, grasslands, and other vegetated areas can can serve as carbon sinks and absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it as biomass in plants and in the soil. We know that this process is essential to offsetting greenhouse gas emissions and reducing the overall concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And in that way, it is a regulating service of the climate. Soil stabilization and erosion control are essential functions as well. Healthy soils, we know, are fundamental to ecosystem function, to agricultural practices. Conserved lands are important. They play a role in soil stabilization. Vegetation cover on lands protects soils from being washed away or blown away. And this, of course, not only prevents land degradation, but it also reduces sedimentation into lakes and rivers. And then lastly, conserved lands can provide essential supporting services that underlie all other ecosystem functions. That can include processes like nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production. Healthy ecosystems contribute to fertile soils and the cycling of nutrients through food webs. I wanted to give a little shout out to one of the most recent agencies established in South Carolina, the South Carolina Office of Resilience, which came out of Governor McMaster's floodwater study group that after a few of the really severe floods that happened in South Carolina, the Office of Resilience came into being, and the Office of Resilience does do some detailed mapping and prioritization of lands that help to sequester floodwaters and protect human communities through the provisioning benefit of wetlands and forest in sequestering water during flood events. And that is an important consideration in how that agency prioritizes investments in land conservation.